In the early Christian teachings, there were people that talked about the separation of the body and the soul, the flesh and the spirit, with the spirit being superior and the body being inferior. And that's had disastrous consequences for Western civilization, because the idea of the body being something that we need to distort or control or manage has left us with eating disorders and sexual dysfunction and sexual distortions that are plaguing us today. There is a real connection between sexuality and spirituality because it's all linked to the same life force energy that we all have. And when we suppress any part of ourselves, we're suppressing that life force energy, and what there is left is a distortion. So they're very connected. And even in terms of Christianity, even in the Bible, there's the Song of Songs, there's a lot of erotic love poetry that the church has historically tried to explain away as allegory. But it really is talking about sexual love between people, between human beings. The church still officially holds the position that the only legitimate sexual relationship is one that is in marriage, where most people nowadays understand sexuality to be an expression between two people. And if it's respectful and mutual and non-exploitive, that means a lot more than whether it's bound by marriage vows or not. But the church's official position is still that the only legitimate sexual relationship is within marriage.
The law is really interesting, right? Because on one hand, it reflects what a society holds to be important, but then it also, I think, can lag behind, you know? And so it's not until those laws are challenged that they change. You know, I think sort of immediately of the impact on women, all women, regardless of their sexual orientation, racialized women, and I think of members of the, you know, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, two-spirited community, laws against those kind of ways of moving through the world. I think, yeah, the law has had huge impacts in those areas.
I think that a lot of laws need to respect the self-sovereign abilities of a human being to actually be respectful and be able to choose for their own life how they wish to live, as long as it doesn't harm another human being. But those are really gray lines, because what you consider harmless, someone else immediately sees as harmful. So, you know, this is a very delicate matters of I guess, further understanding and education.
Silence is one of the most effective means of oppression, I think, is if you can convince an entire culture not to say, to have no words and no talk and no images, then the profound oppression of people whose lives are being erased, excluded, unspeakable, is so harmful. And conversely, talk is so liberating all by itself, finding people to be able to say, this is who I am, who are you, how did that work, what do you think?
One could sort of go way back in history, you know, and there are laws that made it illegal for women to get access to birth control, laws against abortion, laws against you know, so-called sodomy laws that prohibited expressions of sexuality, that outlawed certain ways of expressing sexuality. There's a huge, I think, amount of legal entanglement that has sort of gone hand in hand with sort of oppressing aspects of sex and sexuality.
Technically, prostitution is not illegal. And so that's an annoyance in itself. Why is it being harassed if it's not illegal? And in fact, many of the women in prostitution don't really realize that it isn't illegal because of the attitudes around it.
But we have this law that says that we're not allowed to speak about what's legal to do, and we're certainly not supposed to legally have a place like this that you can carry out those services.
It's a huge thing because there's been many studies done just in the last 5 or 10 years that show that it's so much better for people to be able to operate out of their own homes and be an indoor worker, in other words. It's so much safer than being an outside worker. So that I think that they're seriously considering relaxing their attitudes on that in the courts.
Hookers on Davie was made prior to the injunction 1984, and it followed the lives of sex trade workers who were working in the West End, you know, including our political mobilizing that was going on, because there were organizations that were forming in opposition to us. We demonstrated, we had a march up Broadway with masks on because we didn't want to be charged. There was a period of time that we were fined. There was a street activities bylaw that came into effect by Vancouver Municipal Council. They began fining us up to $2,000. You know, it was a time that they were probably getting ready for Expo, and they wanted to rid the streets of those they considered undesirable. So the Hookers on Davie is a great classic.
You have to remember that I am of a generation that came of age knowing that what I was and what I was doing was illegal. Homosexuality was illegal in this country when I was 20 years old.
When I fell in love with a woman, of course, the first thing I did was run off to the psychiatrist to find out what was wrong with me. And he put me in a mental hospital, which is what they did with lesbians back in the day.
I remember a young acquaintance of mine in the 70s who was a street hustler who was beaten up quite badly by police officers in a back alley in the West End, and showed up on my door all bloody and beaten. And I can still remember my response at the time, which was not outrage so much as it was, Brad, get used to it. You're queer. They're going to beat on you at every opportunity.
They didn't always play by the rules. You know, you constantly get that from people. Oh, they can't do that. They can't do that. Well, let me tell you the things that they can't do that they do. You know, when you're not from a place of privilege, they feel they can get away with a lot of things. And a lot of them do take liberties. And I think it's getting better. But yeah, no, I've had some pretty sad experiences at the hands of the authorities. So.
Certainly in the 60s and 70s, we had that kind of intimidation on a regular basis. It was just expected that the police would treat us badly, that landlords would deny us accommodation if we looked at all fey, that we could lose our jobs, and we could lose our jobs if we worked for the civil service or taught school or anything like that.
I did a lot of work inside the legal profession, just going around saying lesbian, 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 having, you know, being on committees and equality committees and this and that committee, and they couldn't ignore the issue because there I was standing in front of them. And that's a hard road. But it's also, to me, a life-saving road, because the alternative was to stay in a closet. Like, I've never really been in the closet exactly, but I was in the glass closet, as many people were, the don't ask, don't tell closet for years. And it's toxic.
You know, it's difficult emotionally, I guess, to think back to the 80s, during the crises, to remember the indifference of a lot of the rest of the community, and the blame game that went on, and the death toll, which went on and on.
It took a few years before they figured out what was happening, you know, with the immune system and the HIV. And, you know, so many people were affected. Any gains that were made during the 70s went right back into the closet, even further maybe, after the AIDS crisis.
There was a period during the late 80s and early 90s when the death toll was stunning. You were practically afraid to answer the phone for fear someone was going to call and tell you that so-and-so was gone. And we just went to an awful lot of funerals, and we dealt with an awful lot of prejudice. much vaunted Canadian Memorial Society would not handle gay HIV-related funerals except for an extra charge for a number of safety practices they felt they had to institute.
Well, I was involved with Angle's newspaper, and in '84, our cover story was an interview that I did with somebody who was one of the first people in BC to be totally open about having AIDS. Alan Hickox was his name, and he died maybe 6 months later after the interview. And later on, the test for HIV came out, and Angles took the position that you should not get the test. And we took that position because there was nothing to offer, no medications, no treatment, nothing but discrimination in insurance and everything else. So, of course, now it's exactly the opposite. I think you could argue that everybody should take the test, because if you find out you're positive and you get on medications and you stick to them, you're actually less transmissible than someone whose status isn't known.
This city has had a clinic for birth control, contraception, for many, many years, long before the law changed. There was a small group of dedicated pioneers who ran a clinic in an old house near Vancouver General. And the pioneers loved to tell the story about, this would be about the 1940s, when they were having a clinic one evening and a policeman knocked on the door. And they thought, oh no, we're busted and we're all going to jail. And so the person who answered the door was very, very nervous. But the policeman just wanted to check on somebody's car that had been illegally parked. He didn't even realize what the clinic was all about, and they escaped.
My favorite Vancouver artifact is the UBC, the student newspaper for the University of British Columbia. My favorite issue of the UBC is the issue in the 1960s, which featured an article about Anne Rattel. She wanted to get access to the birth control pill. She was a journalist a student journalist working for the UBC. And so she put on a fake wedding ring and she adopted a married name, a fake married name, and she went to the health service at the University of British Columbia as a married woman and ended up with a prescription of the pill. And so the newspaper, the UBC, ran this expose of their student girl reporter getting access to the pill, because we have to remember that the pill was intended for married women to space the births of their children. It was not intended for single women. So the UBC had this very large headline about this girl reporter getting access to the birth control pill. And it printed the doctor's prescription, but it mercifully blacked out the doctor's signature.
Condoms were really, really spoken about, but what I felt was the experience of putting on a condom was never there. You were still left to figure out the remaining part of the puzzle. We've told you what it is, we've told you what it looks like, and we've told you what goes in girls and what goes on boys. And now there will become a day you will have to do it on your own. And that was a sort of missing part for me.
I'm still embarrassed going to the store buying condoms. Is that okay?
My doctor says to me, well, do you use contraception? I said to her one day, duh, I'm a lesbian. She said, don't think that lesbians don't sleep with men. And that was a really good aha moment for me, because of course I had been making that assumption. It was one of those break my own stereotypes.
So I think the strangest incident that I can remember, that I can recall with, in regards to a condom, was the female condom. And at that time, I was very much enamored with a woman. And she herself was probably a great lesson. I didn't know that much when it came to safe sex with my same gender. I figured it was all safe. I really didn't know. And she was very respectful. She was respectful with my body and with hers, and decided that she pulled out a female condom at that time. And thinking that I was quite the expertise when it came to safe sex practices, I didn't know what it was. It looked incredibly large to me. It had a very strange shape. I wasn't sure if it needed a sort of air to be used. I wasn't sure. And then she proceeded to explain to me how she would use this on me. And initially I was really offended. I came out with confusion of it all. I came out with thinking that really engaging with my same gender meant that I didn't have to have all the restrictions that I had on males. And then maybe that was the allure, if you will, of being at that time with another woman. And it ruined the mood. So I really felt like a man. I thought, oh my God, I got to apologize for all my former lovers. Because they're like, seriously, you want me to wear this? and it opened up my mind. It really opened up my mind to understand that safe practices were across the board. And not only could I enjoy myself and let her as well have a very intimate moment with me, but that, of course, it really woke me up, and I realized how much I didn't know. So yeah, big fan of the female condom.
Canada does not have any reference to abortion in its criminal code, and we are one of the few countries of the world where that exists. And a lot of that, I think, is thanks to people from the Vancouver area who way back in the 60s set up an abortion caravan, a group of women who were very active in the whole women's rights area. And again, that was the time when the women's liberation movement was really gaining its momentum. And this group of women started a caravan that went across the country. They picked up women throughout as they went across, and they ended up challenging the government at the time. It was Pierre Trudeau's government. And they were the ones who made that original change in the law happen. Those women, they actually chained themselves to the door of the Parliament buildings. And, I mean, took huge risks. They could have all been chucked in prison, you know, but they did it, and they succeeded.